What if the most dangerous moment for the people surrounding the empath is not when they finally explode, but when they stop feeling the need to save, explain, or chase anyone anymore? Because there is a silent moment that very few people recognize in time. A moment when the empath becomes tired. But this is not physical exhaustion, nor is it simply emotional fatigue. It is something much deeper. It is exhaustion of the soul itself. Carl Jung understood that the human mind can endure enormous amounts of pain, disappointment, emotional pressure, and psychological suffering. But eventually, there comes a point where the unconscious mind activates a mechanism of inner transformation, a kind of psychological disconnection, a silent shift where the person slowly stops reacting the way they once did. And this is exactly what happens to many empaths. For years, they try to understand everyone around them. They try to hold relationships together, give endless chances, forgive people who repeatedly wound them, listen to everyone's pain, rescue broken connections, avoid conflict, carry emotions that were never theirs to carry, and become a safe place for people who were never truly safe for them in return. But little by little, something inside them begins to break. Because the empath rarely destroys themselves all at once. They wear down quietly, slowly, invisibly, and then one day, something changes forever. They stop insisting. They stop explaining themselves. They stop running after people who keep pulling away. They stop trying to repair impossible relationships. They no longer feel the need to prove their worth or beg for emotional reciprocity. From the outside, many people believe the empath has become cold, distant, or detached. But Jung would have said something far more unsettling. They did not become cold. They awakened. Because when an emotionally sensitive person finally stops caring about the very things that once consumed their entire existence, a powerful psychological transformation begins. The empath stops reacting the same way. They begin to observe more and speak less. They tolerate less dishonesty. They become quieter, more selective, more emotionally disciplined, and far more difficult to manipulate. And that deeply confuses the people who were once accustomed to having unlimited access to their emotional energy. Because the truth is this: most people are not afraid of the empath's anger. What they truly fear is the day the empath no longer needs to be understood. The moment that happens, something inside them becomes almost unrecognizable, because the empath, who no longer seeks approval, who no longer chases validation, who no longer begs for love, who no longer tries to save everyone around them, becomes psychologically impossible to control. And that is where the real awakening begins. One of the most painful things about being an empath is that almost nobody notices how deeply they are suffering until they have already emotionally shut down, because empaths rarely collapse in front of other people. They continue smiling. They continue listening. They continue showing up for everyone else. They answer messages, offer support, comfort others, and carry emotional weight, even when internally they are completely exhausted. Carl Jung understood this phenomenon very well. He explained that many people develop a psychological mask in order to adapt to the world, a personality constructed for emotional survival. And in the case of the empath, that mask often becomes the identity of the strong one, the understanding one, the person who is always there for everyone else. But the problem begins when someone spends so many years emotionally sustaining others that they completely abandon themselves in the process. That creates a devastating psychological exhaustion, because eventually the empath begins to feel something strange. They no longer enjoy being around certain people. Conversations start draining them. Complaints exhaust them. False personalities become unbearable. Toxic dynamics begin to feel suffocating. And the most unsettling part is that many times they cannot even explain why. They only feel a profound exhaustion, a desperate need for silence, distance, peace. Jung would have said that this is where the conflict between the authentic soul and the adapted personality truly begins. Because for too long, the empath learned to prioritize everyone else's emotions while neglecting their own. They learned to endure, to justify destructive behavior, to tolerate emotionally unbalanced relationships, to excuse manipulation, to stay loyal to people who continuously wounded them, until eventually something inside them begins to resist. And then a silent sentence appears within them, one that changes their entire life forever. I can't do this anymore. Not because they suddenly hate people, not because they stopped feeling emotions, but because their mind and body can no longer survive the constant betrayal of themselves just to maintain relationships that emotionally destroy them. And that is when something extremely important happens. The empath slowly begins to disconnect. First emotionally, then mentally, and finally energetically. They stop reacting the same way. They stop arguing. They stop defending themselves. They stop trying to convince people to understand them. Because deep inside, they finally realize a painful truth that changes everything. Not everyone deserves access to their heart. And once the empath understands that, their entire reality begins to shift. They begin protecting their energy in ways that seem unfamiliar to others. They become more private, more careful about who they allow close to them. They stop explaining boundaries to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop sacrificing their peace to keep others comfortable. And for many people around them, this transformation feels threatening. Why? Because people who benefited from the empath's endless patience often become uncomfortable the moment that patience disappears. The people who once took advantage of their kindness suddenly accuse them of changing. The people who ignored their emotional needs suddenly complain that the empath is distant. The same people who once drained them emotionally begin wondering why they no longer have the same access to them. But what they fail to understand is that the empath is not becoming cruel. They are finally becoming conscious. Jung believed that one of the most important psychological processes in life was individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating the hidden parts of the self. And for the empath, this transformation often begins when they stop abandoning themselves for the approval of others. Because there comes a moment when the empath realizes something life-changing. Their compassion became self-destruction. Their loyalty became imprisonment. Their understanding became permission for others to keep hurting them. And once they see this clearly, they can never fully return to who they used to be. This is why the awakened empath often appears calmer but far more powerful. They no longer waste energy trying to fix people who refuse to heal. They no longer confuse suffering with love. They no longer believe they must sacrifice themselves in order to deserve connection. Instead, they begin choosing peace over chaos, silence over emotional noise, distance over emotional manipulation. And this is the part many people never expect. The empath becomes stronger precisely because they stop trying so hard to be needed. They begin to understand that true love does not require emotional exhaustion. Real connection does not demand self-betrayal. Genuine relationships do not leave the soul constantly depleted. And once this realization settles into the deepest parts of their psyche, the empath changes forever. Not loudly, not dramatically, but silently, completely. And perhaps that is the most powerful transformation of all. There are people who will never change, no matter how much love they receive. And the moment the empath finally understands that truth, something inside them begins to shift. Suddenly, the things that once controlled their entire emotional world start losing power over them. There is a moment that completely transforms the psychology of the empath. A silent moment, almost invisible, where they stop chasing. Most people never understand the true meaning of that transformation, because for years, the empath usually becomes the emotional pillar of every relationship. They are the one who calls first, who checks in, who tries to fix things before they fall apart. They are the one searching for dialogue, the one forgiving first, the one trying to understand even what seems impossible to understand. But Carl Jung believed that every person has an inner limit, a point where the psyche can no longer tolerate constant emotional imbalance. And when the empath reaches that limit, something changes forever. They no longer feel the need to convince others of their worth. They stop chasing affection. They stop running after emotionally unavailable people. They stop trying to save relationships where they were the only one fighting to keep things alive. And that shift creates a massive impact on those who had become comfortable with the empath's unconditional presence. Because while the empath was chasing, other people felt powerful. They knew the empath would return. They knew they would keep trying. They knew they would forgive again and again. They assumed the empath would always remain there, no matter how badly they were treated. But once the empath finally stops, the emptiness they leave behind begins to feel overwhelming. And this is where something psychologically fascinating happens. Most people only recognize the emotional value of the empath after losing access to them. The empath rarely leaves with drama. They do not usually scream, threaten, or create chaos. They simply stop insisting, and that silence becomes louder than any argument ever could. Jung would have called this the beginning of individuation, the moment when a person starts reclaiming their authentic identity instead of living solely to emotionally satisfy everyone around them. That is why the empath changes so much after becoming emotionally exhausted. They begin protecting their energy. They observe more carefully. They choose relationships more wisely. They quietly withdraw from places where they once begged for emotional connection. And although many people interpret this transformation as coldness, it is often the beginning of psychological healing. Because there is a huge difference between someone who is cold and someone who finally learned not to destroy themselves for others. The empath who stops chasing has not lost sensitivity. They have lost tolerance for constant emotional exhaustion, and that transformation completely changes the way they see the world. Carl Jung understood that the deepest psychological changes rarely happen loudly. They happen in silence. And that is precisely why the empath's silence becomes so disturbing to many people. Those who were used to seeing them explain, react, insist, or fight for the relationship no longer know how to interpret their sudden calmness. But that calmness did not appear overnight. It was born after countless silent disappointments, after feeling emotionally ignored, after giving too much for too long, after trying to hold together relationships that were slowly destroying them from the inside. Eventually, the empath stops arguing because they realize something devastating. Some people will never understand the damage they cause, not because they are incapable of understanding, but because they never truly intended to look within themselves. And from that realization, something changes. The empath stops reacting. They stop trying to prove themselves. They stop explaining every emotion they feel. Instead, they begin to observe. And that silence unsettles people deeply. Others could handle the empath's sadness, anger, or tears. but they do not know what to do when the empath no longer emotionally needs anything from them. Because the silence of the empath usually means one thing: they have already begun emotionally detaching. And once that process begins, it becomes extremely difficult to reverse. Jung would have said that a new form of consciousness starts emerging at that stage. The person begins noticing patterns they once ignored. They recognize manipulation faster. They develop an instinctive rejection toward toxic dynamics they once tolerated out of fear of losing people. Then, something incredibly powerful happens. The empath stops fearing loneliness. And the moment that fear disappears, the entire psychological game changes. Because as long as a person fears being alone, they can easily be emotionally manipulated. But once they discover that inner peace is worth more than certain relationships, they become much harder to control. That is where the real transformation begins. The empath finally realizes they were never born to save everyone else while destroying themselves in the process. And from that moment forward, their energy starts changing. What makes this transformation so shocking is that sometimes even the empath does not recognize who they are becoming. For years, they built their entire identity around one role: being needed. Being the one who supports everyone, understands everyone, listens to everyone, and remains emotionally available no matter the cost. But Jung explained that every profound transformation requires a psychological death first. And for the empath, what begins to die is the endless need for emotional approval. Slowly, everything changes. They no longer feel guilty for creating distance. They no longer feel obligated to respond immediately. They stop sacrificing their peace just to avoid disappointing others. They stop carrying emotional burdens that were never theirs to carry. And although some people see them as distant from the outside, something far deeper is happening internally. They are recovering. Because the exhausted empath lives in a constant conflict between what they feel and what they believe they must endure. But once they stop caring about the things that once consumed them, they begin reconnecting with themselves again. And that reconnection transforms their entire presence. They speak differently. They move differently. They relate to people differently. They become more selective, more intuitive, more aware. And people notice that change immediately because the empath stops radiating emotional desperation. They no longer seek to be chosen. They no longer need to convince anyone to love them. They stop chasing validation. And ironically, that is exactly when they become magnetic. Because inner peace creates an energy that completely changes the way the world responds to a person. Jung used to say that the one who looks inward awakens, and the empath finally begins to awaken when they understand a truth capable of changing their entire existence. They can no longer keep giving away their soul just to be accepted by people who would never have done the same for them. And from that moment on, their life slowly begins to transform. For most of their life, the empath carries an invisible guilt. Guilt for saying no. Guilt for walking away. Guilt for feeling exhausted. Guilt for not being able to save everyone. Guilt for needing space. Even guilt for choosing themselves for once. And Carl Jung understood perfectly how this psychological mechanism works, because emotionally sensitive people often grow up believing that their value depends on how much they can endure for others. They learn to associate love with sacrifice, understanding with endless tolerance, kindness with emotional exhaustion. And this is where one of the most destructive traps for the empath begins, confusing love with self-abandonment. But eventually, something inside them starts to rebel. The body grows tired. The mind becomes overwhelmed. their energy begins to disappear, and the psyche slowly starts demanding something it had needed for years: emotional protection. Then something happens that completely changes their personality. The empath stops feeling guilty for choosing peace, and that changes everything because they no longer respond from fear. They no longer act from the desperate need to please everyone around them. They stop trying to maintain relationships that always leave them emotionally drained, and people notice it. Because the empath, who no longer feels guilty, becomes far more difficult to manipulate. They begin detecting toxic dynamics much faster. They stop justifying disrespect. They start setting boundaries more clearly. And most importantly, they stop constantly negotiating against themselves just to avoid making other people uncomfortable. Jung would have said that this is where the true process of individuation begins. The moment a person stops living entirely according to external expectations and finally begins listening to themselves. That is why so many empaths change so deeply after emotional burnout, because they discover something incredibly powerful. They were never born to save people at the cost of destroying their own mental stability. And when that truth becomes fully integrated within them, they slowly recover a strength they had been losing for years. What is fascinating about the empath is that many people only realize their value once they begin emotionally disappearing. While they are present, people take them for granted. While they listen, they become an emotional refuge for everyone else. While they understand, people assume they will always remain there. But when the empath begins to withdraw, when they stop reacting the same way, when they stop chasing, when they stop insisting, something changes completely in the people around them. Suddenly, others begin feeling a strange emptiness. And Jung would have said this happens because the empath's psychological energy had been silently sustaining many emotional dynamics for years. They were the one calming tensions, the one keeping relationships alive, the one softening conflicts, the one giving endless second chances, the one emotionally supporting others even while breaking apart inside. But once they stop doing that, the masks around them begin to fall. People feel the absence of their energy long before physically losing them, because the exhausted empath no longer enters conversations the same way. They no longer seek connection with the same intensity. They no longer need constant emotional validation. And this deeply confuses those who had become accustomed to receiving their attention, understanding, and emotional energy without limits. Many even try to win them back at that exact moment. But something important happens here. When the empath truly disconnects emotionally, they have usually gone through too much inner pain to easily return, because they did not walk away impulsively. They became exhausted slowly, and that completely changes the depth of their decision. They no longer seek empty promises. They no longer accept delayed explanations or emotional breadcrumbs, because exhaustion finally taught them something unforgettable. Some relationships consume more life than they give back. And when the empath understands this, they begin choosing peace over connection, even if it hurts, even if they miss the person, even if part of them still loves deeply. Because now they understand that loving someone should never require destroying yourself just to keep them. One of the most powerful aspects of this transformation is that many people begin saying the empath is no longer the same person. And they are right, because after certain levels of emotional pain, personality changes. Carl Jung explained that profound crises force the psyche to reorganize itself. The mind cannot continue functioning the same way after years of emotional exhaustion, disappointment, and self-neglect. So a new version of the person emerges, quieter, more selective, more introspective, harder to read. The empath begins protecting spaces they once gave away freely. They start valuing their mental peace more than ever before. They become deeply aware of who truly deserves access to their energy. And because of this, many people perceive them as cold. But they did not become cold. They became conscious. Before, they gave love without limits. Now, they observe. Before, they justified everything. Now, they recognize patterns. Before, they tolerated too much out of fear of losing people. Now they understand that losing themselves was far worse. And this is where something extremely powerful is born. Emotional independence. The empath discovers they can be alone without feeling empty. They can walk away without guilt. They can stop explaining themselves constantly. They can choose silence without desperation. And this completely transforms their presence, because they stop vibrating from emotional scarcity. Now they radiate calmness, depth, inner control, and emotional stability, and people feel it immediately. Jung would say that this is where the empath begins integrating their shadow, the part of themselves they had suppressed for years in order to be accepted, the part capable of saying no, the part that protects itself, the part that no longer tolerates emotional injustice, the part that is no longer afraid of disappointing others in order to save itself. And although this process can feel painful, it often becomes the beginning of true psychological freedom. After so much emotional noise, so many disappointments, and so many failed attempts to sustain impossible relationships, the empath finally discovers something that changes their entire life. Peace is worth more than being understood by everyone, and that realization completely transforms their inner world. Because for years, they believed they had to constantly explain themselves, constantly prove their intentions, constantly make others understand how much they suffered, how much they gave, how much they endured. But emotional exhaustion eventually teaches them something deeply liberating. They do not need to convince anyone of their worth. And Carl Jung would have said that this is one of the greatest psychological awakenings a person can experience, the moment they stop searching outside for the validation that can only be built within themselves. From that point forward, something changes permanently. The empath begins enjoying silence, their own space, calm environments, simple relationships, emotionally consistent people, inner peace. They no longer feel the need to save chaotic relationships. They no longer chase impossible love. They no longer carry emotional burdens that were never theirs to begin with. And for the first time, in a very long time, their mind slowly begins to rest. Because the exhausted empath lives in a permanent state of emotional alertness. But the empath who finally awakens begins consciously choosing what protects their energy. And that changes everything. Their eyes change. Their presence changes. Even the way they love changes. Now they love from awareness, not from emotional need. Now they help from freedom, not from sacrifice. Now they remain only where reciprocity exists, not where there is only emotional exhaustion. And although they still possess enormous sensitivity, they no longer allow the world to use that sensitivity to destroy them emotionally. Because they finally understood something essential, empathy without boundaries eventually turns into suffering, and from that moment on, their life truly begins to heal. Maybe now you understand something very few people realize in time. The empath does not change because they stopped feeling. They change because they felt too much for too long. They felt disappointments they never spoke about. They carried wounds hidden behind smiles. They endured relationships where they gave everything while slowly emptying themselves inside. But eventually, the soul can no longer survive that way. And then the transformation begins. The empath stops chasing, stops begging for love, stops trying to save people who do not want to save themselves. And finally, they begin doing something they had forgotten for years, choosing themselves. And that completely changes their energy. Because when an emotionally sensitive person finally stops caring about what was destroying them, they become impossible to control. They no longer live through fear. They no longer live through guilt. They no longer live trying to be enough for everyone around them. Now they live through awareness. And Jung understood that this is the beginning of true awakening. The moment a person stops abandoning their own soul just to be accepted by others. So if lately you feel yourself changing, if certain people no longer resonate with you, if silence has started bringing you more peace than most conversations, if you no longer have energy for empty relationships, maybe you are not becoming cold. Maybe you are simply awakening. And perhaps there was a moment in your own life when you finally stopped chasing, stopped explaining yourself, and stopped carrying emotions that never belonged to you. That moment changes everything, because some people do not break after pain. They are reborn completely different.